Well, thank you, Shujah Shafi, thank you, Wisdom Council of Britain, for inviting me. Yes, my job is an interesting one, and it's almost unique. There's somebody like me in Australia, but I don't know of any others in the world. The job was invented in the 1970s, when counter-terrorism law first came to Great Britain. And Parliament insisted that there should be an independent person who was security cleared, who could look at what was going on in terms of the operation of the terrorism laws, and could then report to Parliament. And that's what I do several times a year. You can find all my reports on my website, and if you follow me on Twitter, at TerrorWatchdog, you can see some of the things that I get up to. My job is neither to defend the government, nor to attack it, although I do both from time to time. My job is to produce a fair picture that hopefully can inform what Parliament chooses to do. So I'm concerned to see that the laws are as effective as they can be, but I'm also concerned to see that they are not counterproductive or unjust in the way that they operate. And for those purposes, I talk to as many people as I can. People from Quilliam to Cage, but perhaps more importantly than either of those, to people who feel exposed to the operation of the laws, whether that is in Northern Ireland or in Birmingham, or indeed in my own town, Ipswich. Including, and somewhere I expect in the middle, the MCB, whose work I relied upon quite heavily in my report to Parliament of this September. I also listened to the evidence of Harun Khan, Amina Blake and Miqdad Versi to the Home Affairs Select Committee of Parliament a couple of weeks ago. If I may say so, I think they did you proud. What do I hear from the Muslim community? Well, on the one hand, I hear that the UK is one of the best places in the world to be a Muslim. I'm happy to hear that, because on a personal level, I think this country is very much the richer for its Muslims. I'm going to sound like a cheesy politician when I say this, but I can say quite truthfully that close colleagues in Chambers and some of our closest family friends are British Muslims, and that this country would, in my opinion, be a much poorer place without your drive, your generosity and your values. On the other hand, I hear about mistrust of Muslims on the part of other communities, often linked to reports of terrorism, and whipped up by mainstream media, whose coverage can be grossly irresponsible, as I have said in a number of my reports. I see rising numbers of Islamophobic attacks, which to me are every bit as serious as anti-Semitic attacks and homophobic attacks. I applaud Fiaz Mughal and Tel Nama for condemning all such attacks, abuse and threats of violence. And I congratulate the government for the very recent steps it has taken to record hate crime by religion, so we can get a reliable sense for the size of the problem. And I see, finally, what Miqdad Versi described to Parliament as a fear some Muslims have that they are not being treated equally, even, as he put it, some sort of alienation or some sort of feeling of second-class citizens. So what should government be trying to do? It seems to me right, first of all, that it should have strong laws against terrorism. In Northern Ireland last year, there were 22 successful terrorist attacks, many of them against police targets. There was nothing comparable in the UK, either from Islamist terrorists or from extreme right-wingers. Though one only has to look at Anders Breivik in Norway, or to what happened in Paris, Copenhagen and Tunisia earlier this year, to see that complacency about either sort of terrorism would be completely out of order. I can also see a place for strong laws in relation to violent extremism. We are a tolerant society whose strength comes from people's freedom to speak and to worship or not to worship as they please. But people should not have to tolerate threatening or abusive language from the sort of extremists who insulted that Muslim woman recently on the train. And by the same token, however offensive and ill-mannered it might be to draw cartoons of the Prophet, and one could have a debate about whether there is a place for blasphemy laws in our society, I can see no circumstances in which threats of violence or even of death could be an acceptable reaction. Where all these laws are concerned, the trick, as it seems to me, is to bear down strongly on the very small minority who cause trouble in a way that does not alienate the far greater number of good people in the communities from which they are drawn. I'm not going to say much about extremism because Mick Dowd dealt with it at great length. But in relation to extremism, in which I include prevent, I think the record is mixed. I'm sure that many good things are done under the prevent programme. But in my work, I receive more complaints about prevent than I do about the much stronger coercive powers that exist under the criminal law and under the pursue programme. And I regret, as Mick Dowd said, that the prevent programme is not subject to proper independent review. And I don't mean review by an English QC, I mean review by a range of people who have expertise in the internet, in prisons, who understand the affected communities. I think that would be an improvement. I have to be a little diplomatic here, because extremism is not part of my job description. But I do have reservations also over the proposed counter-extremism bill, and I set out some of those in my report of September of this year. I expressed those reservations also rather more bluntly in a letter to the Home Office. I was pleased to see that when the government launched its counter-extremism strategy the other week, it did not launch the bill at the same time, but said that it was continuing to engage widely on it. I hope it really does engage widely, including with bodies like the MCB, which undoubtedly represent significant strands of opinion. Well, I go on to terrorism. We are unfortunately seeing an increase in terrorist plotting in Britain from the few thousand people who are interested in that sort of thing. There were almost 300 terrorism-related arrests last year, about 50% more than the average for the last 15 years. And there was a particularly large rise in the 18 to 20-year-old age group. So to put things in perspective just a little, I should add that in Northern Ireland, with only 3% of the population of the UK, there were 227 arrests under the terrorism acts in 2014 to 2015. Is the arrest power being overused? Well, the figures would suggest to me probably not. Somewhere around half of those arrested in Great Britain, having been subject to a terrorism-related arrest, are charged with a criminal offence, which is a pretty standard figure. If there is a problem, it would appear to be in Northern Ireland, where only 18% of those arrested under the Terrorism Acts were charged last year. Well, what about the executive orders, which are the strongest weapons in the armoury? The strongest of all is the Terrorism Prevention and Investigation measure, under which people can be exposed to a great range of constraints on their activities. You might remember the fuss a couple of years ago when 2 people absconded from those measures. Well, since TPIMs, as they're called, replaced control orders, which were their stricter predecessor in 2011, a total of only 3 new people have been placed under them. That is as it should be, in my opinion. These powerful weapons should only be used as a last resort. But it's a last resort that I consider it's wise to have in a statute book. TPIMs have been tested in the courts against European human rights standards and found to be acceptable. If something cataclysmic happened in Syria and a lot of British fighters were to return all at the same time, resources would be stretched. And speaking for myself, I would rather have something like TPIMs in reserve than Parliament cook up some new power that had not been properly thought through. And I say that with respect to Keith Vaz, who I see has arrived. I'm sure Parliament always thinks everything through very carefully. But sometimes it's better to do these things at moments of calm rather than moments of great heat. When I was appointed to this job 5 years ago, the key issue, I suspect, would have been the old Section 44 stop and search power, used 250,000 times in 2009 alone to stop people in the street and on the rail network without any need for suspicion, in order to see whether they were carrying anything that might be useful in terrorism. It was used perhaps 1 million times in all over the 10 years after 9/11. Well, not a single conviction resulted from those stops. The European Court of Human Rights condemned the power as disproportionate, and to her credit, the Home Secretary, who, it's fair to say, is no lover of excessive stop and search, appeared to agree. The power was promptly repealed, and that particular grievance, I hope, has disappeared. We still have, of course, the Schedule 7 power, which is a no-suspicion power exercised by the police at the ports for the purpose of determining whether somebody is a terrorist. It's fair to point out that this power is exercised on a much smaller scale than the old Section 44. 5 years ago, 87,000 people were interviewed under Schedule 7. Every year since then, the number has declined, to the point where in 2014-15, the number was just 34,500. And that's in the context of 245 million people who travelled through British ports in that period. And of those 34,500 interviews, 88% were completed within half an hour. The police are getting better at targeting their stops as they get booking information, for example, further in advance. They're also adjusting their priorities, concentrating not just on inbound flights, but on outbound flights, where they see themselves as having a safeguarding role, for example, in relation to unaccompanied schoolchildren who might be flying out to Turkey. And unlike the old Section 44, Schedule 7 stops play an important role in producing evidence of prosecutions, in disrupting travel for terrorism, and in providing intelligence. Despite this, I've consistently expressed reservations about Schedule 7. Even if suspicion is not required to stop somebody, it seems to me that the time must come where if the police want to hold on to you, they must have some suspicion. That's within the maximum of 6 hours that they can currently hold you for. It also seems to me that they should need some good reason before they can interrogate your mobile phone or download the contents, and that there should be strict limits on how long that data can be retained. And in making those points, I have been in part channeling groups, including Muslim groups, which have made useful freedom of information requests, and groups like Liberty, which have brought cases to challenge aspects of the Schedule 7 power. This episode has been a lesson to me that engagement, including by the community in these matters, can result in better laws. There were some very sensible changes to the law made in 2014, again in early 2015. And this summer, in a case called Begal, the Supreme Court indicated its agreement with some of the points I've just made. And we'll wait to hear what the government's reaction to that will be. Well, I'm always looking to improve my knowledge of Muslim communities, Muslim people. I will happily travel anywhere in the country if there is anything you would like to show me, or anyone you think I ought to meet. In the meantime, thank you all again for the invitation, and of course I'd be happy to answer any questions.